The manager's voice carried across the lobby, like a verdict already decided before the trial began. "We can't approve financing for someone in your situation, Mr. Cole. I'm sorry." Emily Hart didn't look up from her monitor when she said it, her fingers still tapping through the loan application, as if the man standing across the counter were nothing more than a formality she needed to close out before her lunch break. Daniel stood very still, one hand resting on the counter's edge, the other holding a manila folder thin enough that anyone glancing at it would assume he had nothing worth bringing. He wore a gray jacket 2 sizes too big, borrowed from a homeless shelter donation bin 2 days earlier, and shoes that had been scuffed on purpose with sandpaper that morning. Behind him, a line of 6 customers had gone quiet, the way people do when they sense someone else's humiliation happening in real time and don't know whether to look away or watch. "My daughter has a surgery scheduled in 3 weeks, Daniel said, keeping his voice low. Even the voice of a man who had rehearsed staying calm, because losing his temper would cost him more than the money ever could. "I have proof of employment. I have 3 pay stubs. I'm not asking for a favor. I'm asking you to look at the numbers." Emily finally lifted her eyes, and for half a second, something flickered there, something that might have been guilt, if she'd let it breathe long enough to become anything. Instead, she folded her hands on the counter and delivered the line that would follow both of them for the rest of the story. "The numbers are the problem, Mr. Cole. This bank isn't a charity. If people like you keep applying for loans you can't realistically pay back, it hurts everyone, including the people who actually qualify." A woman in line behind him let out a small, sharp breath, the kind that meant she agreed, and was relieved someone else had said it first. Daniel didn't argue. He picked up the folder, tucked it under his arm, and said only, "Thank you for your time," in a tone so level it almost sounded rehearsed. Which it was, though not for the reason anyone in that lobby could have guessed. As he turned to leave, his eyes moved briefly toward the ceiling, toward the small black dome of a security camera mounted above the teller stations, and something in his jaw tightened before he caught himself and let his shoulders slump back into the posture of a tired, defeated father. He walked past the velvet rope divider, past the granite pillars engraved with the bank's founding year, and out through glass doors that reflected the Chicago skyline in gold light. Nobody in that branch noticed that he paused just outside, pulled a slim phone from his jacket pocket, and typed a short message before slipping it away again. Nobody noticed, because nobody there had any reason to imagine that the man they'd just watched get turned away was the person whose name was engraved in smaller letters than the founders on a brass plaque in the executive elevator 40 floors above their heads. Richard Voss emerged from his office 10 minutes later, drawn by nothing more than routine curiosity about the morning's numbers, and found Emily still sitting at her station, staring at the loan application she hadn't yet closed out. "I heard you handled the Cole situation," he said, leaning against the partition wall with the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted his own judgment. "Good instincts. We can't keep approving sob stories just because they come with a sick kid attached. Corporate's been on us about delinquency rates all quarter." Emily nodded, though the motion felt stiffer than she wanted it to. "He seemed like he really needed it," she said, and immediately regretted how soft that sounded, how much like weakness it might register as. Voss smiled the way he always did when he was about to reshape someone's conscience into something more convenient. "Needing it and qualifying for it are 2 different things, Emily. You did the right thing. Keep doing the right thing, and this branch hits its targets by December." He didn't say what happened to the ones who didn't hit targets, but he never had to. Everyone on that floor already knew. She told herself she believed him the way she told herself a lot of things lately. Because belief was cheaper than doubt, when doubt came with the risk of losing a paycheck her mother's medication depended on. Emily had been at Meridian National for 4 years, long enough to remember when loan officers still had discretion. still had room to weigh a person's character alongside their credit score. That discretion had shrunk steadily since Voss took over the branch 18 months ago, replaced by a scoring algorithm that flagged anyone below a certain threshold as high risk, and a quiet, unspoken understanding that high-risk applicants who got rejected here often ended up within a week or two taking out loans from a company called Faro Capital instead. Nobody at the branch ever explained the relationship between Meridian and Faro out loud. Emily had noticed it anyway, the way you notice a stain on a ceiling long before you admit the roof is leaking. And she'd chosen, every single time, to look somewhere else. That evening, after the branch closed and the lobby lights dimmed to their after-hours amber, Emily found something on the floor near the counter where Daniel had been standing. It was a pen, slim, matte black, with a weight in her palm that felt wrong for something a man in a thrift store jacket should own. She turned it over and saw engraved along the barrel, in letters so small she had to tilt it toward the light, a symbol she recognized instantly, because it was stamped on every piece of stationery in the building, on every internal memo on the wall behind the reception desk 2 floors up in the corporate offices she'd never once had reason to visit. It was the Meridian crest, the private edition given only to senior executives during the bank's 20th anniversary, 5 years earlier. Her stomach dropped, then steadied, then dropped again as her mind scrambled for an explanation that made sense. A gift, maybe. A pawn shop find. Anything other than the obvious, because the obvious was too strange to hold on to standing alone in an empty lobby with the janitor's vacuum humming somewhere down the hall. She almost convinced herself it meant nothing, until she remembered the way he'd looked at the camera on his way out. Not with fear, not with the wary glance of someone used to being watched with suspicion, but with something closer to familiarity. The look of a man checking whether a system he already understood was recording properly. She remembered, too, a detail she hadn't let herself register in the moment when she'd pulled up his account information during the application. There had been a flag in the system. A red internal notice she'd never seen before, cleared and reset within seconds. So fast, she'd assumed it was a glitch. Now holding a pen worth more than her weekly paycheck, she wasn't so sure it had been a glitch at all. She slid the pen into her coat pocket, told herself she'd turn it in to Lost and Found in the morning, and spent the entire subway ride home, unable to stop replaying the sound of her own voice saying "people like you" to a man whose face had not even once shown her anger. Only a patience that now felt less like resignation and more like a man waiting for something to catch up to him. At home, her mother was asleep in the recliner, with the television murmuring low, an oxygen concentrator humming steadily beside her chair. And Emily stood in the doorway for a long moment, just watching her breathe, before she went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water she didn't drink. She thought about the mortgage on Faro Capital's billboard near the highway exit, the one advertising loans with a smiling family and print so small it took 3 readings to find the interest rate. And she thought about how many of the people she'd turned away this year had probably ended up calling that number within days. She thought about Daniel's daughter, a surgery in 3 weeks, and wondered with a discomfort she didn't want to name whether the girl would get it in time through some other means, or whether Emily's signature on a rejection form had just become one more obstacle in a stranger's fight to save his kid. She told herself it wasn't her fault. The policy wasn't hers. The algorithm wasn't hers. But the pen sat heavy in her coat pocket all night. A small, cold weight she couldn't explain and didn't yet understand. She would spend the next several weeks trying to. 3 days later, Daniel returned to the branch, though this time he didn't approach Emily's window. He sat instead in the waiting area near the entrance, flipping through a magazine he wasn't reading, watching the floor with the quiet attentiveness of a man auditing a system rather than waiting his turn. He watched Voss walk a young mother toward the exit with an apologetic smile and a business card for Faro Capital tucked discreetly into her folder. He watched Emily process 3 approvals and 2 rejections without once looking up from her screen. Her movements efficient, practiced, and just slightly too fast to be anything but a woman trying not to think too hard about what she was doing. When he finally stood to leave, he passed close enough to her station that she caught for just a moment the scent of something expensive beneath the thrift store jacket. Cedar and leather. Nothing a man living paycheck to paycheck could afford. She didn't say anything. She only watched him go, the pen still sitting in her coat pocket at home, and felt for the first time since this whole strange encounter began, the unmistakable sensation of standing at the edge of something she did not yet have the shape of, but that she already suspected was going to change everything she thought she understood about her job, her choices, and the man she had so easily called people like you. The pen stayed on Emily's kitchen counter for 4 days before she finally worked up the nerve to look up the crest properly, typing the small engraved symbol into a search bar with the kind of dread usually reserved for medical test results. What came back confirmed everything she'd tried to talk herself out of the night she found it. The crest belonged to a limited commemorative series Meridian National had commissioned for its 20th anniversary, distributed only to board members, senior vice presidents, and a handful of executives whose names she recognized from company newsletters she rarely bothered reading past the headline. She sat there staring at the screen until her tea went cold, trying to construct an innocent explanation. A stolen pen, a gift from an executive to a stranger. Anything that didn't require her to accept that the man she'd humiliated in front of a full lobby might be someone whose name could end her career with a single phone call. She didn't turn it in to Lost and Found. She told herself she would later, once she understood what she was holding. But the truth was simpler and less flattering. She was afraid of what confirming it would mean. Daniel came back to the branch twice that week, each time in a different disguise, so subtle it barely registered as a disguise at all. More like a man simply dressing down for different days. Once he wore a delivery uniform and lingered near the customer service counter, asking vague questions about business accounts, watching the tellers work with the unhurried attention of someone memorizing a routine. The second time he came in an ordinary flannel jacket and stood in line behind an elderly man who was being gently but firmly redirected toward Faro Capital by one of the newer loan officers, a young man named Tyler, who repeated Voss's script almost word for word, down to the phrase, "We want what's best for you, long term." Daniel watched the elderly man leave with the Faro brochure clutched in one shaking hand, and something in his expression, visible only to someone paying very close attention, hardened into the look of a man cataloging evidence rather than merely observing a bad day at a bank branch. Emily noticed him from across the lobby, but said nothing, busying herself with a stack of paperwork she didn't need to reorganize some part of her, hoping that if she didn't acknowledge him, whatever strange unraveling had started with that pen would simply stop on its own. It didn't stop. 3 days later, walking to the coffee shop 2 blocks from the branch during her lunch break, she found him already there, sitting at a corner table with a newspaper folded beside an untouched cup of coffee. And there was no way to pretend the encounter was coincidence when he looked up and met her eyes before she'd even ordered. "Emily, right," he said, and the use of her first name, spoken with none of the desperation she remembered from the lobby, sent a small current of unease through her chest. "Small city," she said, carefully setting her bag down on a stool, but not sitting, keeping one hand braced against the counter as though she might need to leave quickly. "I wanted to apologize," Daniel said, his voice low enough that the barista 3 feet away couldn't have heard it over the espresso machine. "For putting you in an uncomfortable position that day. I could tell you didn't enjoy saying what you said." Emily felt heat rise in her face, somewhere between embarrassment and defensiveness. "I was doing my job," she said, and even as the words left her mouth, she heard how thin they sounded, how much they resembled something Voss might have said to make himself feel better about a decision he never had to live with the consequences of. "I know," Daniel said, and there was no accusation in it, which somehow made it worse. "I'm not angry at you. I'm curious about the system that put you in that position." He gestured to the empty stool across from him, an invitation rather than a demand, and after a long moment of internal argument, Emily sat, telling herself it was only because refusing would look strange, not because some part of her wanted an explanation for the pen still sitting on her kitchen counter. They talked for 20 minutes about nothing important. His daughter's love of dinosaurs, the terrible parking near the branch, the way Chicago winters made everyone slightly meaner than they meant to be. And Emily found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't expected, charmed, despite herself, by a man who listened more than he spoke and asked questions that suggested genuine interest rather than small talk. It was only near the end, as she gathered her things to head back to work, that his phone buzzed against the table, and he glanced at the screen with a flicker of something sharp crossing his face before he silenced it. "Sorry," he said, standing when she stood. The polite instinct of someone raised to consider it rude to remain seated while a woman rose. "Work emergency, or what passes for one in my line of temp jobs." The joke landed a beat too smoothly rehearsed, in a way his earlier warmth hadn't been, and Emily filed it away without quite knowing why it bothered her. As she walked back toward the branch, her phone buzzed too. A text from her mother, asking whether she'd remembered to pick up the refill for her heart medication. And by the time she reached her desk, the strange lunch had folded itself into the background of a day too busy to examine it closely. But that night, lying awake with the pen still on her counter, catching a slice of street light through the blinds, she thought about the way his voice had changed for that one instant on the phone, dropping into something clipped and commanding before he'd caught himself, a tone that belonged to someone used to giving orders, not receiving apologies from bank tellers. The following Tuesday brought the incident that finally cracked something open in her. A woman named Carla Jimenez came into the branch seeking a small business loan to keep her family's laundromat afloat after a burst pipe had flooded half the equipment, and Emily watched from 2 stations away as Tyler ran through the same script she'd heard used on the elderly man the week before, the same gentle redirection toward Faro Capital dressed up as concern rather than what it actually was, which was a pipeline funneling desperate people into predatory interest rates that would take years to climb out of. Carla left in tears, clutching the same glossy brochure, and Emily sat frozen at her desk for a long moment afterward, unable to shake the sensation that she was watching her own reflection from a week earlier. Except this time, she had the distance to see it clearly for what it was. She thought of Daniel's daughter and the surgery in 3 weeks, wondered again whether that story had even been true, and realized with a discomfort that felt almost physical that she no longer knew which version of doubt to trust. The one that told her she'd been wrong to send him away, or the one that told her something about him didn't add up at all. She approached Voss's office that afternoon under the pretense of asking about quarterly targets, but the real question sat differently in her mouth. "Are we supposed to be referring people to Faro specifically?" she asked, keeping her tone as neutral as she could manage. "Is there some kind of partnership?" Voss looked up from his monitor with an expression that flickered just briefly before smoothing back into practiced ease. "Faro's a reputable alternative lender for applicants who don't meet our criteria," he said. "We're not required to send anyone anywhere. We just want to make sure people have options." The answer was technically true and completely evasive, the kind of sentence built specifically to survive scrutiny without actually answering the question asked. And Emily left his office with the certainty, cold and settling, that she had just watched a man lie to her without saying a single false word. That evening, she did something she hadn't done in the 4 years she'd worked at the branch. She stayed late alone and pulled up the internal referral logs for the past 6 months, cross-referencing rejected applicants against a public database of Faro Capital's loan originations that she found after some searching, indexed through a consumer protection watchdog site. The overlap was not subtle once she started looking for it. Dozens of names, people she remembered rejecting, or watching Tyler and 2 other loan officers reject, appeared within days on Faro's public disclosure filings, each one carrying interest rates well above anything Meridian would have offered, even to its riskiest approved applicants. She printed nothing, screenshotted nothing. Yet, some instinct for self-preservation telling her that whatever she was looking at was dangerous enough to require caution before she committed anything to a form that could be traced back to her workstation. But she wrote the names down by hand in a small notebook she kept in her coat pocket, the same pocket where Daniel's pen still rested. An irony she noticed and pushed away before it could mean anything more than it already threatened to. 2 nights later, Daniel texted her a number she hadn't given him, but that had somehow found its way to her phone anyway. A detail she chose not to examine too closely in the moment, though later it would sit among the growing pile of things that didn't add up. The message was simple, an invitation to coffee again, framed as him wanting to properly thank her for the conversation the week before. She should have said no. Every instinct built over 4 years of customer-facing caution told her to say no, to report the strange pen, the strange familiarity, the strange text to Voss, or to HR, or to anyone whose job it was to worry about things like this. Instead, she found herself typing back a time and a place, telling herself it was about information, about understanding what she'd stumbled into with the referral logs and the crest, and the way his voice had hardened on the phone, and not at all about the way his attention had made her feel for 20 unremarkable minutes in a coffee shop like a person worth listening to rather than a means to a quota. When she looked at the notebook in her coat pocket that night, the list of names growing longer, she understood with a clarity that frightened her more than the mystery itself that she was no longer simply curious about a stranger. She was standing at the edge of a decision that would cost her everything she'd spent 4 careful years protecting. And some part of her, quiet but undeniable, had already decided which way she was going to fall. Voss called Emily into his office on a Thursday morning with the kind of casual tone that immediately told her whatever came next would not be casual at all, closing the door behind her with a soft click that felt louder than it should have. "I need you to reject the Alvarez file," he said, sliding a folder across his desk without looking up from his computer screen. Emily opened it and recognized the name immediately. A small family requesting a modest loan to cover repairs on a delivery van that supported their business. A file she herself had reviewed the day before and flagged as approvable. The numbers clean, the credit history solid. Nothing about it resembling the high-risk profiles she'd been trained to turn away. "This one qualifies," she said, keeping her voice steady, even as something cold settled in her stomach. "The debt-to-income ratio is fine. I already ran it twice." Voss finally looked up, and the practiced warmth he usually wore around the branch had thinned into something flatter, more direct. "Corporate wants the numbers to look a certain way this quarter. I need you to find a reason. There's always a reason if you look hard enough." She stood there holding the folder, feeling the weight of it, the way she imagined a verdict must feel in the hands of a judge who already knew the sentence was unjust. And for the first time in 4 years, she said the word she had trained herself never to say to a superior. "No." Voss blinked, clearly unaccustomed to the syllable coming from her, and recovered quickly into the tone of someone explaining something simple to someone slow. Emily, I'm not asking. I'm telling you what needs to happen. If you can't find a technical reason, I'll have Tyler process it. But I'd rather it come from you since you already reviewed it. It looks better that way. The phrase, looks better, landed with a weight she hadn't expected, revealing without meaning to that the entire exercise was about optics, about numbers that could survive an audit rather than decisions that could survive a conscience. She left his office without agreeing to anything, the folder still in her hands, and spent the rest of the morning staring at the Alvarez file, with the growing uncomfortable certainty that whatever she did next would be the first decision in her career that couldn't be undone by pretending she hadn't understood what she was doing. She approved it anyway, quietly, before lunch, submitting it through the system with a note citing the exact metrics that justified it, and told herself that if Voss asked, she would simply say she'd followed policy as written, which was technically true, even if everyone in that building understood policy as written and policy as practiced were two different animals entirely. The small act of defiance left her hands shaking slightly at her desk, an adrenaline she hadn't felt since she was a teenager sneaking out past curfew. Except this time, the stakes were her mother's medication and the roof over both their heads rather than a missed bus home. She half expected Voss to storm out of his office within the hour, but the day passed without incident, and by the time she left the branch that evening, she understood that the silence wasn't relief. It was just Voss deciding how he wanted to handle it, which felt, if anything, more dangerous than an immediate confrontation would have been. That night, she met Daniel at a small Italian restaurant 3 blocks from her apartment. A place with checkered tablecloths and a candle stuck in an old wine bottle. The kind of unpretentious spot that felt deliberately chosen to put her at ease, though she couldn't decide whether that was thoughtfulness or calculation. She told him without meaning to at first about the Alvarez file, about Voss's instructions, watching his face carefully as she spoke, searching for the flicker of something that would confirm what she already suspected about who he really was. He listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly at certain details, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before asking, "Do you have documentation of what he told you? Anything in writing?" The question sat strangely against the backdrop of a man who was supposed to be a struggling father worried about his daughter's surgery. A question that belonged instead to someone who understood exactly how internal investigations worked. What kind of evidence held up, and what kind evaporated the moment it was challenged. "Why does that matter to you?" Emily asked, setting down her fork. The warmth of the evening suddenly edged with something sharper. Daniel held her gaze for a moment that stretched a beat too long before he answered. "Because if what you're describing is true, it's not just wrong. It's the kind of thing that eventually gets someone fired, and I'd rather it not be you who takes the fall for exposing it." It was a good answer, careful and reasonable, and it should have satisfied her, but something in the precision of it, the way he'd anticipated her question before she'd finished asking it, reminded her again of the pen sitting on her kitchen counter, and the crest she'd looked up 3 times now, as if repetition might change what it meant. "You ask a lot of questions for someone who came in here needing a loan for his daughter's surgery," she said finally, watching him closely. Something crossed his face then, brief and unguarded, gone before she could fully name it, and he reached for his water glass instead of answering immediately. Buying himself a second, she noticed, and filed away. "I ask questions because I've been where those people were," he said eventually, and the sentence was true in a way he didn't elaborate on. True in a way that would only make sense to her weeks later, once she understood which parts of his life he was drawing from and which parts he was performing. She let it go that night, not because she believed him completely, but because some part of her had already decided that whoever he really was, his questions were pointed in the same direction her own conscience had been pointing for days, and for the first time since this had all started, She felt less alone in the discomfort that had been building since Carla Jimenez walked out of the branch in tears, clutching a Faro Capital brochure. 2 days later, the retaliation Emily had half expected finally arrived, though not in the form she'd anticipated. Voss didn't confront her directly about the Alvarez approval. Instead, he reassigned her to processing overdraft disputes, a demotion in everything but title, the kind of quiet punishment designed to be deniable if anyone ever asked why it happened. "Just cross-training," he told her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good for your development." Emily understood the message clearly enough. Step out of line again, and the next reassignment would come with a smaller paycheck attached, or no paycheck at all. She sat at the overdraft desk that first day, feeling the particular humiliation of being punished for doing the right thing, made worse by the fact that nobody around her would ever know that's what had happened. That from the outside, it looked exactly like an ordinary staffing decision, rather than the warning it actually was. That evening, sitting on her fire escape with a cup of tea going cold beside her, Emily finally opened the notebook where she'd been recording names from the referral logs and added the details of the Alvarez file, the exact wording of Voss's instructions, the date and time of her reassignment. Building something without fully admitting to herself what she was building it for. She thought about Daniel's question at dinner about documentation, about whether he'd meant it as a friend's advice or something else entirely. And for the first time, she let herself sit with the possibility she'd been avoiding since the night she found that pen. That he might not simply be curious about the system. That he might already know more about it than she did. That his presence in her life over the past 2 weeks might have far less to do with gratitude for a coffee conversation than with something considerably larger she hadn't been allowed to see the shape of yet. She didn't confront him about it. Not yet. Some instinct telling her that whatever answer she got before she had solid evidence of her own would only be another carefully constructed truth designed to keep her calm and cooperative a little longer. Instead, she kept working, quietly, methodically, cross-referencing every name she could find, printing nothing, sending nothing through channels that could be traced, building a paper trail entirely on paper, the old-fashioned kind that lived in a notebook rather than a server Voss or anyone above him could access and erase. When Daniel texted her again 2 nights later asking if she wanted to get dinner that weekend, she found herself typing yes before she'd fully decided whether she meant it as the beginning of something real or as a way to stay close enough to whatever he was hiding to understand it before it understood her first. Lying in bed afterward, staring at the ceiling, while her mother's oxygen concentrator hummed faintly through the thin apartment wall, Emily realized that somewhere in the last 2 weeks, without meaning to, she had crossed from being someone who followed rules she didn't believe in to someone actively building a case against the people who'd made those rules. And there was no quiet way back from a line like that once you'd already stepped over it. The notebook had grown thick with names by the time Emily decided she couldn't sit on what she knew any longer. 31 applicants rejected at Meridian's branch over 6 months, 27 of them appearing on Faro Capital's public loan disclosures within 2 weeks of their rejection, each one carrying interest rates that made the phrase alternative lender feel like a euphemism for something closer to extortion. She spent an entire Sunday transcribing the handwritten pages into a formal document on her home laptop, careful to keep it off any device connected to Meridian's network, cross-checking dates against her own memory of conversations she'd overheard in the break room, half-sentences from Tyler bragging about hitting his quota, a comment Voss had made once about how Faro's owner had been generous during last year's holiday party. None of it was a smoking gun on its own. Together, it formed a shape too consistent to be coincidence. And Emily understood that shape well enough now to know exactly who she needed to show it to, even if she had no idea yet how to get an audience with anyone senior enough to act on it without going through Voss first. She decided to request a meeting with the regional compliance office, a department she'd only ever interacted with through mandatory annual training modules. Drafting an email so carefully worded, it took her 3 hours to write 4 paragraphs framing her concerns as questions about referral policy rather than accusations, protecting herself in case the whole thing collapsed before it ever reached someone who cared. She sent it on a Tuesday morning and received an automated reply promising a response within 5 business days, a timeline that felt unbearably slow given how exposed she now felt every time she walked past Voss's office, wondering if he somehow already knew what she'd been building in the quiet hours after her shifts ended. That same week, Daniel had been oddly hard to reach. 2 texts left unanswered for most of a day before a brief reply came back, explaining a work conflict, an explanation that struck her as thinner than his usual careful honesty, though she chalked it up to nerves of her own rather than anything about him. On Thursday, compliance responded faster than she'd expected. Not with an email, but a phone call, a clipped voice asking her to come to the corporate headquarters downtown the following Monday to discuss her concerns in person. A request formal enough that Emily spent the weekend rehearsing what she would say, printing her notebook pages into a clean binder, rehearsing the exact wording of Voss's instruction on the Alvarez file, until she could recite it without her voice shaking. She told no one at the branch where she was going, calling in a personal day instead, and took the train downtown Monday morning with the binder clutched against her chest like something that might dissolve if she loosened her grip. The Meridian corporate tower rose 40 stories above the financial district, a building she had walked past 100 times without ever once considering she might someday need to walk inside it, carrying evidence against her own branch manager. The receptionist on the ground floor directed her to the 38th floor, explaining that her meeting had been moved to a conference room near the executive suite rather than the compliance offices 2 floors below, a detail that struck Emily as strange but not alarming. The kind of scheduling quirk that happens in large buildings with more departments than available rooms. She rode the elevator up alone, watching the numbers climb, running through her opening statement one more time, and stepped out into a hallway so quiet and carpeted so thick that her footsteps disappeared entirely, replaced by the low hum of central air and the distant murmur of voices behind closed doors. A young assistant met her at the elevator bank, introduced herself briefly, and led Emily down the hall toward a glass-walled conference room where several people were already seated. More people than she'd expected for what she'd assumed would be a conversation with 1 or 2 compliance officers. She saw the back of a man's head first. Dark hair, broad shoulders in a suit clearly tailored rather than borrowed, and told herself it meant nothing, that plenty of men in this building had dark hair and good tailors. Until he turned slightly to say something to the woman beside him, and Emily's entire body went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It was Daniel. Not a version of Daniel dressed differently, not a coincidental resemblance she could talk herself out of, the way she'd talked herself out of the crest on the pen and the hardness in his voice on the phone weeks earlier. It was him sitting at the head of a conference table with a nameplate in front of him that read, Daniel R. Cole, President and CEO, in letters too small to have caught her attention from across the room, but unmistakable once her eyes found them. Sitting exactly where a chief executive sits, flanked by people who deferred to him, with the small automatic gestures of employees used to deference being required rather than earned. The room seemed to tilt very slightly. Or maybe it was just her own balance failing for a moment, as every interaction of the past 3 weeks reassembled itself in her mind, with a violence that left her breathless. The pen, the camera glance, the phone call at the coffee shop where his voice had hardened into command. The questions about documentation that had sounded too precise for a man supposedly unfamiliar with internal investigations. The dinner where he'd asked so carefully whether she had anything in writing, not as a concerned friend, but as a man building a case of his own. A case that apparently required her cooperation without her ever being told what she was cooperating with. "Emily," Daniel said, standing, his voice carrying none of the warmth from their coffee conversations, replaced instead by something formal and careful, the tone of a man who had rehearsed this moment and still wasn't sure it would land the way he wanted it to. "Please, sit down. I know this is a lot to process at once." "You knew," she said, not moving from the doorway, her voice flat with a fury that surprised even her. A fury that had less to do with the money he clearly didn't need, and more to do with the weeks she'd spent doubting herself, questioning her own judgment, wondering whether she was losing her mind over a pen and a phone call while he'd been sitting on the truth the entire time. "You knew this whole time. Every conversation, every dinner, you knew who you were. And you let me sit there thinking I was falling for some stranger with a sick kid." Daniel's jaw tightened, and for the first time since she'd met him standing in the branch lobby with a folder full of fake pay stubs, he looked genuinely uncertain of what to say. "My daughter's surgery story wasn't entirely fabricated," he said quietly. "My niece had that surgery 2 years ago. I used details I knew because I lived through them. But yes, the application, the jacket, the shoes, all of it was constructed. I was investigating this branch specifically because we'd flagged unusual referral patterns to Faro Capital, and I needed to see how the rejection process actually worked from the inside, not from a report someone on my staff had cleaned up before it reached my desk." "So I was an experiment," Emily said, the binder still clutched against her chest, refusing the seat he'd offered, refusing to let her body relax into a room designed, she now understood, entirely around the comfort of the man at its head. "A field test, something to observe while you decided whether I was corrupt enough to fire or naive enough to feel sorry for." "No," Daniel said, sharper now, stepping around the table toward her, though he stopped himself a few feet away, seeming to understand instinctively that closing the distance further would not help. "You were the person who approved the Alvarez file against direct instruction from your manager at real risk to your own job because you thought it was the right thing to do. That's not corruption, Emily. That's the opposite of what I found everywhere else in this branch." He gestured toward the binder in her arms. "Is that what I think it is?" She didn't answer immediately, some protective instinct telling her not to hand over 3 weeks of careful, dangerous work to a man who had just proven decisively that he was capable of letting her believe a lie for as long as it served a purpose he hadn't bothered to share with her. "You should have told me," she said instead, her voice lower now, less angry and more exhausted, the adrenaline of the reveal giving way to something heavier. "At any point in the last 3 weeks, you could have told me who you were, and instead you let me sit across from you at dinner, explaining my own manager's misconduct like I was handing you a favor, when really I was handing you evidence for whatever this is." She gestured at the room, at the people watching the exchange with the careful neutrality of employees who understood their jobs depended on appearing not to notice things they were in fact noticing very closely. "I should have," Daniel admitted, and the simplicity of the admission offered without excuse or qualification was the first thing he'd said since standing up that sounded entirely unrehearsed. "I told myself I was protecting the investigation, that revealing myself too early would compromise the evidence, or put you in a position where you'd feel obligated to help me, rather than choosing to on your own. But if I'm honest, some part of it was that I didn't know how to tell you without losing whatever this was becoming between us. And I chose the version of caution that protected me, instead of the version that respected you." The honesty of it didn't undo the hurt sitting hard in her chest, but it shifted something, made the anger slightly less absolute, even as the humiliation of realizing how thoroughly she'd been observed remained sharp and unresolved. "What happens now?" she asked, finally stepping into the room, though still not sitting. To Voss, to the branch, to me. Daniel gestured to the woman beside him, introduced as the bank's head of internal audit, who explained in careful, measured language that Richard Voss had been under quiet investigation for 6 weeks based on referral pattern anomalies flagged by an automated compliance system that Daniel's undercover visits had been intended to corroborate what the data suggested but couldn't prove on its own, and that Emily's notebook, if it contained what they believed it contained, would likely be the piece of documentation that moved the case from suspicion to certainty. You won't be punished for approving the Alvarez file, the woman added. If anything, it's the single clearest example of an employee acting against pressure to do the right thing, and it will be treated that way in any review of this branch's conduct. Emily finally sat more from the weight of everything settling at once than from any real willingness to be in that room a moment longer than necessary, and set the binder on the table without pushing it toward anyone yet, some final instinct telling her that trust once broken, this specifically wasn't handed back over just because an explanation had finally arrived. I need time, she said, looking at Daniel directly, ignoring everyone else in the room for the length of that sentence. Not to decide whether to give you this, she tapped the binder. Because Voss needs to answer for what he did regardless of anything between us. But I need time to figure out whether anything you told me at that coffee shop, at that dinner, was actually you, or whether I was talking to a version of yourself you built, the same way you built that jacket and those shoes. Daniel didn't argue with her, didn't try to talk her out of the distance she was drawing. And something in his stillness, the way he simply absorbed the accusation without flinching away from it, told her that whatever else he was, he understood exactly how much damage his silence had done, and he wasn't going to compound it by rushing her forgiveness before she was ready to consider whether it was even his to ask for. The investigation into Richard Voss moved with a speed that surprised Emily, though she would later understand that speed was the natural result of evidence arriving to confirm something the compliance department had already suspected for weeks, rather than evidence arriving to start an investigation from nothing. Within 3 days of that conference room meeting, Voss was placed on administrative leave pending review, a phrase delivered to the branch staff in a brief, carefully worded email from regional management that mentioned nothing specific, though everyone who had worked under him long enough understood exactly what kind of email that was. Tyler, the young loan officer who had recited Voss's script to Carla Jimenez, and the elderly man with the shaking hands, was called downtown for questioning separately and came back to the branch 2 days later, noticeably paler, no longer making the small, confident jokes he used to make about hitting quota. Careful now, in a way that suggested he understood how close he'd come to losing far more than a job. Emily handed over her notebook on a Wednesday morning, sitting across from the same head of internal audit she'd met in that conference room, a woman named Patricia Okafor, who reviewed each page with a slow, methodical attention that made Emily feel for the first time in weeks that the work she'd done alone in her apartment at night actually mattered to someone besides herself. This is thorough, Patricia said, looking up from the final page, more thorough than what our own systems flagged. You didn't have to build this. You could have stayed quiet and let the automated system do the work eventually. Emily thought about Carla Jimenez crying in the lobby, about the elderly man's shaking hands around the Pharaoh brochure, about the version of herself who had once said "people like you" to a man she now knew was testing exactly how far the branch's cruelty would extend before someone stopped it. I couldn't watch it happen anymore and pretend I didn't understand what it was, she said. And Patricia nodded slowly. The kind of nod that acknowledged the cost of that decision without pretending it had been an easy one. The formal findings came 3 weeks later, delivered first to the branch staff in a mandatory meeting, where a regional vice president explained in language stripped of anything specific enough to invite a lawsuit, that Richard Voss's employment had been terminated following an internal review, and that Meridian National was severing all referral relationships with Faro Capital effective immediately, along with a broader audit of every branch that had shown similar rejection patterns over the past 2 years. What the staff meeting didn't include, but what Emily learned later through Patricia, was that Voss had not acted entirely alone, that a former board member, since retired, had originally structured the arrangement with Faro years earlier as a quiet revenue stream disguised as customer service, and that Voss had inherited both the arrangement and the pressure to maintain it when he took over the branch. A detail that didn't excuse what he'd done, but did complicate the story enough that Emily found herself unable to feel the clean satisfaction she'd expected when she imagined this moment weeks earlier. Voss wasn't purely a villain who'd invented cruelty out of ambition. He was a man who had been handed a corrupt system and chosen repeatedly not to be the one who finally said no to it, which was its own kind of failure, even if it wasn't the same as inventing the failure himself. Daniel didn't attend the staff meeting, a choice Emily later learned was deliberate, made specifically so that the resolution would read as compliance-driven and institutional rather than as a personal vendetta carried out by an executive who happened to have a stake in how the story ended. She appreciated the restraint, even as some part of her noted with a complicated mixture of relief and lingering hurt that his absence meant she had time and space to process everything without his presence pulling her attention in 2 directions at once. He texted her once during those 3 weeks, a short message asking only how she was doing. No mention of the case, no attempt to explain himself further or hurry her toward forgiveness. And she left it unanswered for 2 full days before finally replying with a single line, telling him she was fine and needed more time. He responded simply, "Take whatever you need," and didn't text again after that. A silence that felt, in its own way, like the most honest thing he'd done since the day she'd first met him under false pretenses, because it required no performance from either of them, only patience. The branch itself felt different in the weeks that followed Voss's termination, lighter in a way Emily hadn't expected, as though the entire staff had been holding their breath around a decision none of them had been allowed to question and could finally exhale now that the pressure had lifted. A new interim manager arrived, a woman named Grace Liu, transferred temporarily from another branch, who spent her first week simply listening to staff concerns rather than issuing new directives, and who approved 3 loan applications in her second week that Emily was fairly certain would have been rejected under the old scoring priorities. Carla Jimenez, whose laundromat loan had been the incident that finally pushed Emily toward compiling her evidence, received a call from the branch informing her that her application would be reconsidered under revised guidelines. And when she came in to resubmit her paperwork, she cried again. Though this time, it was different, and she hugged Emily across the counter with a gratitude that made the entire ordeal for one clarifying moment feel worth every sleepless night it had cost. It was nearly a month after the conference room revelation before Emily agreed to see Daniel again. And even then, she insisted on choosing the location herself. A small park near her apartment, rather than any restaurant or office where the balance of power might tilt in his favor simply by virtue of who was hosting whom. He arrived in ordinary clothes, jeans and a plain jacket. Nothing performative about the outfit this time. Nothing constructed for a purpose beyond simply being comfortable on a cool afternoon. And Emily noted the difference without knowing whether it was meant as a message or was simply what he wore when he wasn't working an angle. They sat on a bench near the pond watching a group of children feed bread to a cluster of ducks who seemed entirely unbothered by the drama of human affairs unfolding a few feet away. And for a while, neither of them spoke, the silence not entirely comfortable, but no longer as brittle as it had been in the weeks immediately following the reveal. "I've been thinking about what you said," Daniel finally offered, keeping his eyes on the pond rather than on her, giving her the option not to respond if she wasn't ready. About whether any of it was real, or whether you were talking to a version of me I constructed. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. I've built a lot of careful versions of myself over the years, Emily. My father lost control of this company once a long time ago, through a scandal that had nothing to do with me directly, but everything to do with the name I carry. And I spent most of my adult life terrified of being seen as reckless or naive or too trusting, the way people said he'd been. I built the version of myself who investigates things personally, who doesn't delegate the parts that matter, who doesn't let anyone get close enough to compromise an outcome. That version is useful. It's also lonely. And I think somewhere in those 3 weeks of talking to you at a coffee shop and a checkered tablecloth restaurant, I stopped performing that version and started actually wanting to know what you thought about things that had nothing to do with the investigation. Emily turned this over slowly, watching a duck chase away a smaller one from a piece of bread with a viciousness that seemed almost comic against the gentleness of the afternoon. That's a nice thing to say, she said finally. But it doesn't change the fact that I spent 3 weeks doubting my own judgment, wondering if I was losing my mind over a pen and a phone call, while you already knew exactly what was going on and let me sit there working it out alone. I know, Daniel said, and didn't try to soften it further. Didn't offer another layer of explanation designed to make the omission smaller than it had been. I've thought about how to apologize for that in a way that doesn't sound like an excuse, and I don't think there is one. I should have told you sooner, even if it complicated the investigation, because you deserved the choice of whether to help me knowingly, rather than being observed while you made decisions you thought were private. She appreciated more than she expected to, that he didn't try to explain away the hurt, didn't insist that the ends justified the means, or that she should simply be grateful the outcome had worked in her favor. What happens to you now? She asked instead, redirecting the conversation toward something she genuinely wanted to understand. Now that everyone at the branch knows who you are, now that this whole thing is public within the company at least, do you go back to being invisible, or does this change how you run things? Daniel considered the question longer than she expected, watching the ducks settle back into their earlier calm now that the aggressive one had claimed its bread and moved on. I think it changes how I run things, he said. I spent years believing the only way to know what was actually happening inside this company was to hide who I was and observe from a distance, because I didn't trust people to tell me the truth if they knew who was asking. But you approved that loan file against direct instruction from your manager before you knew anything about who I was. You didn't need my identity to know what the right thing was. I think I built an entire method around the assumption that people needed to be tricked into honesty, and you proved that assumption wrong in a way I haven't fully sat with yet. The admission settled something in Emily that she hadn't realized was still unsettled. A fear she hadn't named even to herself. That perhaps she had only done the right thing because some instinct had sensed, unconsciously, that the stakes were higher than they appeared. That her integrity had been performance rather than genuine conviction. Hearing Daniel articulate the opposite, that her decision had preceded and had nothing to do with his identity, gave the act back to her as something she could actually claim, rather than something that had happened to her. I'm not saying I forgive you yet, she said, and meant it, though the edge in her voice had softened considerably from where it had been in that conference room a month earlier. But I don't think I hate you either, which is further than I expected to get by this point. Daniel allowed himself something close to a smile, careful not presumptuous. The smile of a man who understood he hadn't earned the right to relax yet, but who could feel cautiously that the door hadn't closed entirely. They began seeing each other again slowly over the following weeks, Not dating exactly, not yet, but something adjacent to it. Coffee after her shifts. A walk along the river on a Saturday when neither of them had anywhere else to be. Conversations that gradually stopped circling the investigation and started drifting toward ordinary things. His niece's recovery from the surgery that had inspired his cover story. Emily's mother's health and the particular exhaustion of being someone's primary caretaker, while also trying to build a life of her own. Daniel never pushed for more than she offered, never treated her hesitation as an obstacle to overcome through persistence rather than patience. And it was this restraint, more than any grand gesture, that slowly convinced Emily that whatever she'd felt during those first careless weeks before she knew his name had not been entirely manufactured, that some genuine core of the man she'd met in a thrift store jacket had survived the unmasking intact. The formal resolution of the Voss case arrived publicly 2 months later. A brief item in the local business section, reporting that Meridian National had terminated its relationship with Faro Capital following an internal audit, along with a statement from the bank's new compliance framework emphasizing stricter oversight of referral practices across all branches. The article didn't name Emily, didn't name Daniel's undercover involvement, kept everything appropriately vague in the way corporate statements are designed to. But Emily kept a printed copy of it in the same notebook where she'd once recorded 31 names in careful handwriting. A small private acknowledgement of the version of herself who had chosen, alone and afraid, to build a case against people with far more power than she had. Faro Capital itself came under separate regulatory scrutiny in the months that followed, its predatory lending practices attracting attention from a state consumer protection office. Once Meridian's severed relationship made the arrangement visible to people who had the authority to investigate it properly. Though Emily learned about that development secondhand, no longer feeling the need to track every consequence personally, now that the immediate wrong in front of her had been addressed. On a Friday evening in late autumn, nearly 4 months after the day Daniel Cole had stood at her counter in a borrowed jacket, asking for a loan he didn't need, Emily found herself back at the same branch after closing, staying late not out of necessity, but because Grace Liu, the interim manager who had since been made permanent, had asked her to help train 2 new hires on the revised lending guidelines. Guidelines that emphasized individual case review over rigid algorithmic scoring. Guidelines Emily had, in the small and quiet way, helped shape through the testimony she'd given during the broader company audit. She was locking up the front doors when she saw Daniel waiting outside. No disguise this time, no thrift store jacket, just an ordinary coat against the evening chill. Standing exactly where he'd stood the day she'd sent him away with a sentence she still occasionally heard echo in her own head when she was tired enough to let old guilt resurface. "I have something for you," he said, holding out a small box that she opened carefully, revealing not jewelry, which she'd half-braced herself against given the direction their evenings together had been drifting, but a pen. Matte black, identical to the one still sitting in a drawer in her apartment. Except this one, when she turned it over, was engraved not with the Meridian crest, but with a small line of text too fine to read in the dim streetlight. She held it up toward the branch's exterior lamp and read it slowly. "For the one who didn't need to know who I was, to know what was right." "I had it made after the meeting where you gave Patricia your notebook," Daniel said, watching her read it with the careful attentiveness of a man who had waited weeks for the right moment to give it to her and wasn't entirely sure even now that the moment had arrived. "I wanted you to have something that meant the opposite of what the first pen meant. That one was evidence of a lie. I wanted this one to be evidence of something true." Emily closed her hand around it, feeling the same unexpected weight she'd felt weeks earlier when she'd found the first pen on the branch floor. Except now, the weight didn't feel like a warning. It felt like an anchor, something solid enough to hold on to after months of uncertainty, about what any of this had actually meant. "I'm still not going to pretend the last 4 months were easy," she said, looking up at him, the streetlight catching the edges of an expression she no longer bothered hiding from him. Tired and hopeful in equal measure. "But I don't think I want to keep holding the anger anymore either. It's heavy, and I've been carrying it long enough to know the difference between holding on to something because it protects me and holding on to it because I'm afraid of what happens if I let it go." Daniel didn't reach for her, didn't rush the moment past what it needed to be, simply stood there in the cooling evening air, outside the branch where all of this had started, giving her the space to close whatever distance remained on her own terms rather than his. She was the one who stepped forward, finally closing the gap between them with a decision that felt for the first time since the day she'd watched him walk out of that lobby with a folder full of fake documents, entirely her own, unclouded by doubt about who he really was or what he really wanted from her. "For what it's worth," she said, quiet enough that it felt like something meant only for the two of them and not for the empty street around them. "The version of you I met at that coffee shop before I knew any of it, that's still the version I like best." Turns out he was real the whole time, even underneath everything else. Daniel's hand found hers then, careful asking rather than assuming, and when she didn't pull away, something in his shoulders eased in a way she hadn't seen since long before she'd known his real name. The particular relief of a man who had spent years believing he had to hide behind constructed versions of himself to be safe, finally allowing himself to be exactly who he was in front of someone who had already seen both versions and chosen to stay anyway. They walked away from the branch together as the last of the evening light faded behind the downtown skyline, past the same glass doors where a poor father had once been humiliated for a crime he hadn't committed, where a bank teller had once said words she would spend months learning to forgive herself for, and past the granite pillars engraved with the founding year that meant something different to Daniel now than it had 4 months earlier. No longer simply a legacy he was terrified of tarnishing, but a foundation he finally trusted himself to build honestly upon, with someone beside him who had proven without needing his name or his money or his power to do it exactly what honesty was worth.